They bought about 13 farms, the old farms that were in that area, Bloomington and Bloomington Hills. Their original plan was to grow carrots. But all of a sudden the decision was, well, let's grow some people.
And I got to say, it's a beautiful day in Bloomington 100 times a day.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
Well, I'm tempted to start this episode by saying it's a beautiful day in Bloomington.
Well, it is today, as a matter of fact.
This is such an awesome opportunity, and we're so grateful that Jeff Morby and Connie Morby are here with us today. We're going to talk about Bloomington and their involvement there in that transitional time in our community's history, but also their coming together as husband and wife and raising an absolutely wonderful family in Utah's Dixie, and also Connie's roots, because she's as deeply rooted in Dixie as anybody can be. The reason I started the way I did is because my wife, Debbie, worked for Jeff Morby at Bloomington in the property management in the mid-'70s. And that's her biggest memory, number one, of what a great boss Jeff Morby was, but number two, of answering that phone time after time and saying, it's a beautiful day in Bloomington. And I think you could honestly say that pretty much 365 days a year, and you still can. But Jeff, maybe as we start here, just tell us a little bit about how you came to St. George and how you came to be part of that great development at Bloomington.
Well, thank you, Lyman. It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, you've been a hero of ours for a long time with your historical world and, well, the things you've accomplished. So we're honored to be here as guests to be able to say a few things about my early roots. Of course, Connie was here long before I came, but I arrived probably, 1971, drove into town in my little car and hit the first only stoplight, in Main Street and St. George Boulevard, I think it was. And it was a blinking yellow. It wasn't a stoplight. And I took a left there and then out Main Street and then arrived in Bloomington at the end of the freeway. That was where it ended at that point in time. So it wasn't going anywhere other than Bloomington was the last stop. So that for me was my introduction to a new town. I grew up in Ogden, Utah, and then I went to the University of Utah, graduated there in 1970, and went to work for a company called TerraCore while I was in school. And I worked at the headquarters for the company on 529 East South Temple. I'll never forget that spot. So upon graduation from the university, they offered me a full-time job to stay with them. Jim Kimball was my boss, and he was an amazing historian as well, and he offered me a job to stay there in Salt Lake and work in the corporate office for however long they wanted, I guess, was the approach. But so my assignment was to work with him and all the staff that were there in that headquarters, which were mostly females. That was interesting for me as a young 24-ish, I think, and trying to manage, gals that were much smarter, I'm sure, than I, and trying to tell them what to do and all that kind of stuff. So for me, it was like, oh boy, here we go. And what a great time for me there in Salt Lake it was. And then an opening came here in St. George, where the project called Bloomington and Bloomington Hills were being developed by the company TerraCore. And that was under the direction of Ellis Ivory and Roger Boyer and Frank Johnson were the principals of the company. And Mr. Kimball, Jim Kimball, said, hey, we want to send you down there to St. George and be the property manager of the properties that...
What was your initial thought when you thought about coming down?
I said, St. George, where is that? I don't even know. I mean, I've traveled obviously through, but, in the old days, you used to go down and take the right. You wouldn't go by Bloomington. You'd take the old highway and go through Santa Clara. So I had no knowledge about where this project called Bloomington was located. So I said, well, okay, let's go. But prior to that, though, I did come down and have some visits before I actually moved, and that's where I met Connie. She's looking a little puzzled, but...
Let's come over to you, Connie, and let's take up the story from your perspective growing up here, and then that point where you met this fellow.
Well, I grew up in St. George, a little town that we could just walk to, and there was a stoplight, and then down the street was the yellow flashing down by the College Street. Had to make that clear. But I crossed that stoplight street every day because I lived right there. And so it was just a little town, and so to me it was always, oh, let's go to Cedar and shop. Can you believe that? Cedar, or Salt Lake, or Provo, but to me Cedar was big too. So it was just a fun place to grow up and have family and pretty much know everybody. I was at Dixie College at the time, and I'd worked at a little Mexican restaurant called Nina's on Tabernacle Street, if anybody can remember that. Not Paula's, but Paula's aunt, I think it is. And then I had a chance to go work at Bateman Pharmacy just around the corner. And then a close friend of mine worked at the sales office in Bloomington. She worked there, and her husband, and I got to be friends with them. So she was leaving, and so she asked me if I wanted to go do that job. And I was really kind of afraid because it was a big deal. Bloomington was a big deal, I thought. And so I took over her job at the sales office, and I got to say, it's a beautiful day in Bloomington 100 times a day. Always. It's
even when it was raining.
or hot or whatever. So that was fun. And I would go into town to get supplies, like from Tri-State Office Supply, would get our business supplies. And I'd go in there. My neighbor worked there. Several elderly ladies worked there, and one of them was my neighbor. And she said, it'll never go. It'll never go. And I go, we'll see, One thing about my job that was so fun is because they had a crew of salesmen that worked there, and they were all, I won't say hot, but good looking. But they were all married too. So, but they got to be really close friends with them and their wives. And then it was time for me to go to college. I'll just jump ahead to say how we totally got there. And one of the salesmen said, I want to line you up with this guy. And I'd already seen him bring a girl down to Bloomington in the sales office, so I already knew kind of who he was. So anyway, I got lined up with him up in Salt Lake, and then I came home after graduation, and he got transferred down here, and so eventually we...
So you were at Bloomington before Jeff.
Oh, yes.
Well before Jeff. And Bloomington had begun to form in 1968
was kind of the kickoff. They had, Billy Casper came to town. Yeah. And in fact, we've got a picture of that gathering at the golf course where he said a few words and kind of started the whole, the first tee there at the Bloomington Country Club. So that was quite a great experience. I think I was there. I can't remember. The old picture showed I've got that snapshot where
even that, in that early, when that first opened, you were down here. But it wasn't until 1971 that you came down to work here. But you guys had already met, and...
We dated a little bit in Salt Lake, and then she told me she had some other interests elsewhere, so I kind of took a back seat.
Well, I had to keep up with him.
Anyway, we dated a little bit, and then when I moved to town, it was, she was here now. She graduated from Utah State and was back home working. Where were you working? At the
school board office.
Yeah. Okay.
But my days at Bloomington were so fun. I worked at the sales office when there was no bridge, and they had a fleet of cars, mostly wagons. I got to drive them because I'd have to go over across the river to the country club because that was being built, and the golf course the pro shop was a trailer, I think it was. So I actually forged the river if it wasn't too deep. Otherwise, I'd have to go around the back way.
We take that Manowar Bridge for granted. I mean, like it was always there, but it wasn't. And that's what kind of makes me think of you guys and everyone in that generation that was involved in Bloomington as pioneers. You were pioneers of a new era in St. George. And that, Jeff and Connie, in the amazing way that you were and so many others, you were trailblazers and opened the way for something new. That must have been pretty neat, Connie, to grow up in Little St. George and then be able to work for a company like TerraCore.
Oh, yes, it was. I just was a small fry, but I had fun. I would give people tours. I'd answer the phone all the time and make reservations. They'd stay at several hotels in St. George, like the Coral Hills and the Royal Inn. Anyway, there was 3 that would make reservations all the time, and they had choices. If they came up and looked at the project, they could go. We had skiing in Bryan Head, boats in Lake Powell, horses. There was a stable of horses, a beautiful stable, before the school was built. I got to do that and take people on tours, and we had displays explaining everything, so I got to do that and then turn it over to a salesman. So it was fun, so fun.
I want to talk more about that whole vision and business model as it started, but I want to drop back first to Bloomington as it was pre-TerraCore. And I don't know, Connie, if you or your family ever went down across there, but I remember as a little boy, my dad taking me down in the truck. I don't know how we got there, but we got right down into where the golf course is now, and then he took me to that rock, the Indian rock, with the petroglyphs. And it's right now nowadays it's right in the middle of a neighborhood, but it was in the middle of nowhere as I remember it as a little kid. And I think my mom and my little sister were with me, and we had a picnic on that rock. And that's my early memory of that place. But then you go back even further, and the first people who came here to grow cotton in 1858 were at what was called Heberville, which had to be pretty close to where you guys live, I would think.
Heberville was down a little bit on the river.
They called it Price. I think it was first called Heberville, and then they called it Price. And to think about those very first people, even before the group that came to settle St. George, they were down there trying to eke out a living and survive down there. And I have that memory of being down there and just thinking, I'm so far from anywhere in such a desolate place. But then we saw all the ruins of the old homes, and I know you guys have been involved in some of that restoration and history there. But the Larson family and the Carpenter family and
the home, there was Price City, and then there was down the river, and Ralph Atkin could probably give you a better story on this for sure. There was Atkinville, and then Heber City, which was then renamed Price. Then across the river, which was of a settlement called Jamestown. But they changed the name from Jamestown, which is where there's an old restored home there, and there's one other house that's fallen down that's on our property. And then there was the school that was right there, with the foundation is still there. So the kids from Price City would come there to school, and also from Atkinville, they would come there to go to school. It was a trek because the Atkinville kids would have to cross the river to get to school. And that little settlement there called Jamestown, and then later Bloomington, there was a broom factory, there was other homes right in that particular area. And this is interesting. I'm going to jump a little bit, but one of the reasons that the Ivorys looked at this property was there were about 13 farms that Clark Ivory, who was the father of Ellis Ivory, as I recall the history, as I've read through some notes and everything that's available to me, they bought about 13 farms, the old farms that were in that area, Bloomington and Bloomington Hills. Their original plan was to grow carrots. That was their plan. But didn't do well, I guess. I'm not sure. I don't know anything about that. But all of a sudden the decision was, well, let's grow some people. And then thus the golf course became a reality, and built the Bloomington Country Club first over where it, of course, sits. And that was on the Heaton farm. Most of it was on the Heatons, where that's located. And then Billy Casper came and dedicated it. history of that club is a whole different world, but now it's it's still there in operation and doing very well, I think, financially, and been a real asset to the community. So,
Connie, I thought that was so awesome how you remembered the lady at Tri-State saying that'll never go. And I think that's what I heard in my house too, like that'll never go. And I think a big part of that is the old timers knew that place was a hard place. They knew that for the most part they made brooms through much of the history. It was a broom factory and it was a hard place you had to be pretty tough. And those families were amazing families that lived there. And through the decades, the ones that stayed found ways to make it work. But I think the general feeling among the townspeople was, what would you want to try to make a resort out of that place? And it's so awesome to think, because we did have the Red Hills Golf Course by that time, but the idea of a championship golf course, full golf course and country club, that was so beyond anyone's imagination in this town.
Well, and it was used for resort a lot. People would come, and a lot of the first housing was condominiums, so that they could come and stay and play golf, then go home, and that type of thing. So a lot of the first activity was building the golf course condos, and then the smaller ones across the street from there. There's about 72 total condos that were built originally. So, wow. But the big problem we had was water. We did not have any culinary water, and that's where St. George City and the likes of Rudger MacArthur stepped up and said, "We'll provide you water." We purchased water from the city, because we were in the county, so that was our source of water, which was always interesting. But without that, it would have never happened, because we had a lot of wells, irrigation wells, but they were not quality water that you could drink. They were good for irrigating alfalfa, but that was it.
You had that Virgin River running through there, but that water's without a multi-million-dollar plant to run it through is not very good.
Well, the only fish that could survive in there was the wound fin, and that was it. So there was never too many trout that were coming out of that stream.
I wanted to come back to that big barn, that original big barn, because it represented something really awesome to me in my early teen years. And it strikes me, Connie, your cousin, John MacArthur, we live across the street from each other. We grew up together. He became a golfer, and a great golfer, but I'm a horseman. And it's like I've never set foot on the Bloomington golf course, but I have a history right there at Bloomington during the equestrian, during those early years of Bloomington, of rodeos and horse shows. And I remember my dad taking me down to Bloomington. I was probably 12 years old, 13 years old. I'd have been 13 because it was 68. And he said, "I have a horse I want to show, or there is a horse I want to show you." And he took me to that barn and took me in, and they had the great quarter horse, Sugar Leo. That meant something to me. I didn't know who the great golfers were, but I knew what the great quarter horses were. And that was an element of Bloomington that really connected for me. And then I got to participate in a lot of horse and rodeo events there during those early years while that part of the original development was there.
Well, the first part of Bloomington, to be developed was the ranches, which was where they were acre lots, a little bigger than that, acre lots, and also half-acre lots. And acre lots, you could have horses on site. And so that was really one of the major marketing efforts, was to have that as an aspect where people could build their homes, have their horses on site, and then go riding anytime they wanted to. And then the stables was for helping, those horses kind of be maintained and had a veterinarian on site and all that kind of thing. So it was a horse-driven project to begin with. Golf was kind of secondary.
In the same light that you brought Billy Casper in, you also brought in one of probably the most legendary calf roper of all time, Dean Oliver. Mm-hmm. And And George Andrus, who was sort of the pro and the best roper in St. George in those days, had a head-to-head match roping with Dean Oliver and George Andrus, and they each roped 10 calves. And for me, that was the same thing as a golf aficionado, being able to go see Billy Casper. And so there were both parts of that were really special, at least in the mind of a early teenage boy like me. And I always thought, well, maybe I'll be a golfer someday, but I ended up
More comfortable on a horse.
Okay, first of all, Lyman, it's a stable. It's not
Yes.
a barn.
You
It was
know
a
what?
beautiful stable with
I'm-
horses
I
that could poke
stand
their heads
corrected.
out of the door. You know how they do? I always wanted a horse. I wished for a horse every birthday cake, either a horse or boots. Anyway, that's a long story. But so I would take my friends because I could use all those amenities, the Lake Powell boats. I didn't go skiing up to Bryan Head, but horses, I would take my friends or my brother out on a trail ride. And I was taking my girlfriends. I was home from college and worked there for the summer. And I saw those old plugs that just plugged along the trail. I saw one, Andrews's Finley John was out working with a horse. And I said, Finley John, he was so shy, I want to ride that one. So he let me, and it wasn't ready. And I was not a horse woman anyway, but I thought I was. So I get on it, and it ducks its head and goes under there used to be a thing in front of the stables, and started running down the road as fast as and I was so scared. He didn't buck me off. I think I just fell off because I was so scared. And then my dad raced to get me and took me to the hospital. And anyway, that was my stable experience because I thought I knew a lot, and I didn't. But it was so fun to go there.
Those are harrowing experiences, but great to be able to talk about many years later, huh?
Yeah, I'm making
Well, the ironic thing is that, it's now an elementary school,
Yes.
and our grandkids and our kids went there to school. So in a lot of ways, it was a kind of a neat transition in some ways, I guess, rather than it just getting plowed away. I mean, the stables went away, but when it got built there, it was a nice elementary school, which has been pretty sweet for our community out there.
So, Jeff, tell us about coming here and your involvement and what you saw through those early years into...
My boss in Salt Lake was Jim Kimball. I don't know if you know Jim at all, or yeah, he's an amazing man and kind of my mentor when I was in Salt Lake. And I worked for him pretty much all the time in Salt Lake. So he called me and said, "Hey, we want to send you down to St. George." And I said, "Excuse me? What for?" He said, "Well, we've got some changes down there. We need you down there and kind of take care of the rental program and all that stuff." And so I said, "Okay, here we go."
Can I break in right here? So you were called to Dixie.
Pretty much, I think. Yeah, he extended it to me and said, "Okay, here we go." But so, I came down and drove my car down, and like I said, drove into town. There was a one stoplight, and took a left and came out to Bloomington and said, "Okay, where am I?" And I had two friends that had ironically come down before me that I went to high school with at Ogden. I mean, you can imagine that. Niall Harbertson and Terry Monson were already here. Terry was the golf professional, and Niall was the Bloomington Country Club manager. So then I came and was working on the rental properties in the project. So the three of us who grew up together in Ogden were now all of a sudden in St. George, Utah, Bloomington, single, trying to find our brides. And so there we were. And it was good, I think those two have been really close friends of mine. Terry Monson passed away not too long ago, and Niall Harbertson, Butch, is up in Salt Lake area. We see him occasionally, but so what a great companionship for me to come to, and we lived together. Everybody was a little bit concerned about our three bachelors out in Bloomington. Who are they? But anyway, we all got married here in St. George. Terry married Shelley Peterson, who was here in town and worked out at the golf course and at Red Hills. Butch married, she was from Salt Lake, but anyway, they got married and lived here. And then, of course, Connie and I dated her once up in Salt Lake, but that was about it. And then she graduated from Utah State and came home. And then when I arrived, she
Followed me here.
dating somebody else quite seriously.
So you were called to Dixie, but you had really good incentive.
I had some good incentive, but when I got here, it was like, oh, she's gone with somebody else, so I'll just have to figure it out. But fortunately for me, we started dating a little bit, and I asked her to marry me in the Pizza Hut on St. George Boulevard. She said no, and so I regrouped a little bit. About 3 months later, on the doorstep of Valentine MacArthur's home, I tried it again, and she said yes. So there we are, 50 years later.
We built our little house close to the fire station. Some days we'd wake up and there'd be cattle on our front lawn.
You're talking about in Bloomington.
Yes.
And you were down in it's kind of the gardens area
in the gardens.
near the firehouse. And at that time, you were probably by yourselves down there?
Pretty much.
Yeah, there were more houses now, but cattle on our front lawn. And we did have one fire in Bloomington, and we lived by the fire alarm from the firehouse. In the middle of the night, a house was burning, so we got up for that. Just different things like that.
See, I said you were pioneers. You had cattle on the lawn. You were pioneers.
Well, we gained a great respect, I think, for the history of Bloomington, for the pioneers, frankly, really quick when we bought the property just below our first home, and then just took a lot of time to get that, so we could move there with sewer and water and all that stuff. But, the old foundation of the home there, we've had since then. Olin Lee painted that school back when it was in operation with the teacher at the door and a couple of kids out front. And he painted it for us. We have that in our home that shows that original school where these kids come to school in Bloomington, begin their life in the educational world. It was kind of neat, so we've loved it ever since. We're still there and loving it.
In those first years, you were involved in property management?
Yes, that we managed the homes. People would come from the sales world and buy a townhome as a second home, pretty much. Not too many first-timers were living in those townhomes. And then they would come occasionally, and we would rent it out when they weren't here. So we rent it like a week at a time or whatever. And then eventually, though, the Bloomington Country Club was where they'd play golf. Well, the country club moved from the developer to the members, and the members weren't too anxious to have a lot of guest play from us. So they kind of changed the rules a little bit for us, so that staying there and playing golf was not an option for those guests that we had. So eventually, over time, people that owned them started moving there permanently, and then the ones that are a little smaller were great kind of little starter homes for a lot of younger families, so they moved into those properties a little bit. There's 72 of those.
Is it correct to say that really you started the second home concept in St. George?
I don't know if there was other places at the time, but yeah, it was a new concept, state and countrywide, where a lot of developments throughout the whole country had this concept.
And I think, Connie, going back to the dear lady at Tri-State, that's a concept that our parents and our grandparents wouldn't get, that there would be people in other places who would buy a second home here and come and stay here for a period of time.
And I'm sure most of them were trying to figure out how to afford one home, let alone have another house and responsibilities for that. So I think the economy certainly aided. And then we've had, our dips and valleys in the economy in the 2008s, right through there, where everything went south economically and real estate-wise. And, yeah, there's been some certainly up and downs on the affordability of people being able to do that and have two homes and maintain them.
We would drive to St. George to go to church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then we were able to have a building fund, and all the members worked hard to do stuff, and we built a church of our own.
Chapel at
A chapel.
Okay, I'm
building.
Check off another pioneer box there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was.
There was a lot of local folks involved.
Fun to have our own. We were all so close, and it was a great time.
It's when they let you kind of do your own thing, So the Larsons were brick mason people, and they did the brickwork, and the concrete was done by a lot of contractors that lived in the area, Leroy Merrill and all those.
So the Larsons at Bloomington, the original Larsons at Bloomington, the first Lars Larson was a mason on the temple.
He was.
So it goes all the way back.
I don't know the connection there, but yes, there was the Larsons and the Blakes. Larry Blake has some family that, his family was the ones who were in the Blake farmhouse, it's called today. So, yeah, there's a lot of roots there from the local.
And you've been real conscientious with different people involved in preserving some of those homes and some of that original pioneer.
We take care of the Blake farmhouse from forever ago. The family that bought it and restored it, since we lived across the street, they asked us to kind of manage it and look over it and stuff. So we've been doing that for a long, long time, and it's been fun because people have come and stayed that were so interesting to get to know. Second grade at Bloomington Elementary started coming on a tour. And I'd give them a tour. They'd come to our house, and I'd tell them about the school and the church foundation of Bloomington's. Above that was the old post office, and that was on a lot. Our first home was right there with the post office, and that was neat until somebody built a house over it. But so we still have the schoolhouse and the church house, and then I'd take them around. I'd tell them some sweet stories about that, and there are some, and then would take them over to the farmhouse and let them look around a little bit and pick a pomegranate and stuff like that. But that was kind of a tradition that was fun to do.
You've lived there for how many years?
Well, 50 in our home now. I think we've been
49 maybe.
49, and then we were in our first home for 51 years.
Let me tell you one thing about clear back in those days. We saw some people coming over to the farmhouse, and every time we noticed someone, we go over to see if everything's okay. And there was an elderly lady there. She was in her 90s, early 90s, and her son. And they told us that they owned that Heaton farm before TerraCore bought it. They had it. Her husband wanted to do the same thing, basically, that TerraCore did, but it was just them. And it was so sweet for her to tell us, oh, my kids were in this bedroom and they did this on the wall and they did that. I mean, for us to know that she actually lived there and they were going to do that, and then it didn't work out that they could, but it was interesting to get to know.
So, Jeff, TerraCore had to have a pretty amazing vision to come and do this. They started out, they were going to grow carrots, and then somehow that became a vision of creating a...
Well, the three main principles, Ellis Ivory and Roger Boyer and Franklin Johnson were really the founders, creators, and the vision of the company that they called TerraCore. And so Clark Ivory and the generation before that were, just solid people. And these three men grew up together. They knew each other and created this company called TerraCore. And we were all over the country. We were in Florida and Wisconsin and Arizona and all over the country doing developments. But it was a major effort to try and finance that. The financing was the bigger challenge and problem. So, and then in the economy, when people were not able to purchase your product that you start maybe 2 years ago to get done, and then all of a sudden it's not a potential that you're going to find a lot of buyers, that's when the economy really pretty well took hold, and they had to file what was called a Chapter 11 bankruptcy for protection for the existing property owners, that they could finish the improvements under the bankruptcy, which they did. And so everybody who bought a lot got what they paid for. And this was in the 80s, probably 81, 82, 83, right through there. And so the end of that, part of the big way that became a potential was that the city of St. George did allow us to be annexed into the city, which was a huge game changer. Without that, I think Bloomington would be a ghost town, because if we wouldn't have been able to have the city's utilities and so forth, then it wouldn't have worked. So from that point of view, her uncle Rutger MacArthur and all the pioneers, basically that were in the city council and so forth, were ones who said, hey, this will work. We're going to do something to make sure that this doesn't go away, and that these folks who bought these properties and homes can have a place that they can grow up and raise their families, and all the things of which has happened since. So including, Bloomington Hills, which was bigger, as far as size and number of homes and lots than Bloomington was. So between those two projects, it was about 4,000 lots or somewhere in that range and neighborhood. A lot of acres of property as well, and 2 golf courses, all those kind of things. So anyway.
So, Jeff, if we go back to the early 70s, just like any venture, it could have not happened. I mean, it might not have gotten over the hump. What is it that made Bloomington break through that original thought of this thing could never work?
I think the vision that these 3 men had, Ellis and Frank and Roger, they just weren't willing to say, okay, we're going to quit on this. They persevered and did, I think, all the things they could do, and then it kind of turned a direction that they really had no control over, and a new entity came in and took over the company and the assets of what was left, and then were able to finish the improvements that were started. So all the improvements were done, and the lot owners and homeowners were in a place where they weren't going to have to sell their home because there was no water to drink, type of thing. So there's just a ton of things that came together at one point in time that said, okay, this is a gathering place. And I don't want to get too historical with you, but Brigham Young, when he came here in 1862, Lyman, he stood down here at the end, down at the south end of town, and looked back up at the valley of St. George and simply said, I see towers and spires and the things of which, and it wasn't a house south of the temple, it was just basically the early pioneer days. And what he saw was what's here today. I don't know what the county's population is now, but you're probably 200,000 maybe, somewhere in that range.
I know what the big difference is.
Okay.
What made it are the people that came. We had amazing people that came from all over, and they were...
Yeah, for sure.
It was just so fun to meet them and their different backgrounds and all their kids, and it was just neat. Just brought us to...
Really, I think you've hit it. Because I remember I was in high school in 71, 72, 73, and our Dixie High School was recharged with all these great people that moved to Bloomington. It was really awesome. And I can remember so many great people that came into our classes during those years, and it was like we'd grown up in this little sort of isolated community, and now we had these really great people moving in.
They were strong in the church, and whether they were or not strong in the church, they were just good people.
Well, too, as well, I mean, the little towns like Santa Clara and Washington and Hurricane and all their growth and their development over time was, there's been some amazing people that grew up in those communities, similar to, St. George, but what a gathering of some unbelievable folks now. Then from all of this too, Lyman, the Sun River world, the retirement world, which now is, south of Bloomington and was originally going to be a part of Bloomington, but just that was phase 3 that never happened. But, Darcy Stewart and his group came in there and built Sun River, and I think there's, like 2,000 homes down there, and all kinds of great people that have moved here from their retirement years. And there, other projects similar to that are underway as well. So truly, not religiously or not, Brigham Young saw what I think it really was going to be happening here in this community.
And that was that first sort of vision, and this is going to happen. But then people had to come, and just like the people of Terricore, they had to have the courage to say, this is what we're going to do to bring that vision. And that took a lot of risk. It took a lot of courage. I think back about how invested they were in it. I mean, just the fact that they brought Billy Casper, they did all these things because they believed what they were doing was going to change this community. And it did. It did in powerful ways. President Holland talks about St. George history, and he talks about before Bloomington and after Bloomington. And that's that crux, that transitional point. And then all the great things that came after. I think of Bloomington, and then I think of Green Valley, and then I think of all the golf courses, and then Sun River, and all of these things. But it really started with Bloomington.
Yeah, and the start there was not necessarily looking at development, so to speak, quote unquote. It was more of a farming venture where they wanted to grow some carrots, and from that came a lot of people. So I think that was, kind of a destiny situation where the Ivorys and the Boyers and the Johnsons saw another opportunity and said, hey, let's go, So it was just a lot of combinations there and a lot of things I think that fell into place. And without the city of St. George really saying, okay, we're here to see that this works, through Rutger and the early mayors of the town, it was especially, looking forward to working with all of them. And politics changed a little bit, but I think the main point was to try and do what we could do to make development a good thing for those who are here in the future.
The two of you are such an important part of all that. I know you're very humble about that, but it's just so awesome to think that you've lived there. You've been a part of Bloomington and part of all of that for over a half century. You both look like you just graduated from college.
Lyman.
There's so many other things that you've done, too. I know you know the history of this area so well because the two of you headed up the Historic Sites mission here in town.
Yeah, we did. We were fortunate to have that assignment. That was a fun experience. Yeah.
And before that, you were mission leaders in Portland, Oregon.
Portland, Oregon.
That must have been an amazing experience.
That was, for sure. That was 3 years of, like, where do we go? It was, like, unbelievable for us as far as our service, and especially the young missionaries that we met, some 565.
And senior missionaries.
Senior couples as well. Yeah, it was fun. We had a great time. Still see a lot of them now today, and hopefully stay in touch with them forever, so...
But then now you're back here in Bloomington, and I'm imagining you'd never want to live anywhere else.
No, we're not going anywhere.
He's developed quite a few different housing projects and things, and we're here, and we dug our roots deep, and we're staying.
So tell us, as we kind of wind down here, tell us about the blessing of being able to raise your family here in this community.
Well, here's one thing, and let me just start off. From my point of view, at least when we were first married, it would look like to me, and this is just an observation personally, not any demographical study, but most of the kids, after they graduated from high school or college here, or the 2-year Dixie College, had to leave town to go to school and find their way there. Then when they graduated and came home, not a lot of jobs to do. You could do the personal businesses that their families might have owned, but, that can only go so deep. So most of those children had to leave town to get a good job to raise their family. I think the change for me was that all of a sudden St. George became a place you could stay. All 6 of our children live here in St. George. They all have good jobs. They all have met their brides and husbands here in St. George. All of our grandchildren here live here in St. George. So, exception of a couple that have moved, there's a couple that have moved up north. But so for me, it's like, whoa, look at the change from 1970s to today, where the economy and the location and the opportunities are that you can stay here and make a good living and have sufficient for your needs and be able to enjoy living here in this great community. So that's my take on it anyway.
And to me, when we first were raising our kids, it was like how I was raised. In a town, I could walk to church or walk to the swimming pool or do a lot of things and not be worried about it, ride my bike. And so for a while there, before Bloomington went, I felt like it was safe. They could have their friends over, and they knew everybody.
I think it still is, for sure. I think obviously you got to be cautious, and we got a great police force, all that. Those are needed items. You can't, we had the Bloomington Police Department out here. I think we had 3 policemen that worked for us, and they were day and night, traveled the streets and all that kind of thing. So that's a huge element of any community, to have good security. You need those municipal services to help make sure things are in good order. So
We as a community are blessed that you are here. That's a really special thing, to be able to look at the two of you, Connie with your deep, deep roots here, and Jeff having become adopted to this place, and the impact that you've had, and all for good. And I think it's just all part of this great Dixie story. And the two of you and your family embody that so beautifully. And I just want to thank you for spending a few minutes with us today. It's so great to get to visit with you.
You're very kind.
thank you.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.